Sarissa the warrior, Sarissa the queen, Sarissa the killer, Sarissa the great. Sarissa ended up with many titles, but the first of these is perhaps the most important. Sarissa the warrior. Sarissa grew up in a small town, in a small kingdom. She was a farmer's daughter. She helped on the farm and was strong and eager of work. She did not shirk her duties. And so when it came that there was time for entertainment, she partook without fear that she was not doing her part. She was a wonderful dancer and singer, the pride of her village. But she didn't feel any great need to prove herself. When she got her title, Sarissa the warrior, it was during the time of the marches. This was when the king of the local small kingdom would march from town to town in the local area, and each town would greet him, and there would be food and the music and dancing, and then the adults of the town, or at least some of them, would march with him to the next town, pass the king on to the next town. And so he would do this, marching around the borders of his territory from town to town. It was a chance for towns to outdo each other, a competition to see who could welcome the king with the greatest skill and with the most wonderful celebration, and who could march him on his way with the highest spirits. Sarissa was chosen for her skill, both in dancing and in singing, to welcome the king. And she practiced for days. She practiced a traditional dance that goes back to several hundred years before, one of the king's great-great-great-great-grandmothers. She was a queen, of course, as one goes, and her husband was a benevolent ruler, and she had 2 beautiful children. But one day the husband was betrayed by his brother, and the king was taken over by a despot, by an evil, dictatorous ruler, who found pleasure in cruelty. This queen stayed quiet for the sake of her children. But when the new king, decided that the children were a risk, they could form rebellion. After all, these were the rightful heirs to the throne. To protect his own son, he sent knights to kill the children who were staying in the royal apartments. The queen heard word of this, and it is said in the legends that she put on her husband's old armor, took up her husband's old sword, and became an embodiment of battle itself. And the dance and song that Sarissa was to perform was a traditional telling of this tale, an ancient dance that told of the queen surrendering herself to the battle gods and becoming their embodiment, becoming a true warrior, dancing through battle and destroying all in her path and saving her children. Sarissa practiced and practiced day and night for many weeks until the entire dance was part of her rather than just something she had memorized. And so we come to the time when Sarissa gained her title, Sarissa the warrior. The town had gathered at the edge of the buildings. All the people stood out in their best clothing. Sarissa wore the traditional costume of people to dance this dance. It was lightweight armor, yes, but armor still the same, made of real metal, beaten thinner than normal armor, so that the dancer could take the weight, and with wider joints than most armor, so the dancer had movement, but still, she was carrying quite a weight of metal and felt hot and somewhat disgruntled. The men of the village wore their Sunday best, fresh-pressed clothing, all in the muted browns and greens of border village men, but they were dressed well. When they started hearing the noise of the approaching party, they started to smile and laugh and joke among themselves. It was one of the older ones who had been to war with the king before, who raised his hands and called for silence. The sounds were wrong. Although the woods muffled the sounds of the approaching party, the sounds did not sound like merriment and cheer. There were no musical instruments playing. Normally, when the king did his marches, he moved from town to town at the head, surrounded by a group of knights, and were cheered into each town together. But the first people to burst from the trees were not knights. They were the people from the next village, normally held in some minor disregard, joked about as being inbred, of course. But now no one joked. These people had fear written on their faces, stamped across their brows, and they fled with great eagerness towards the village, yelling hurriedly, "Run! Run! Gain your swords!" Women and children ran screaming towards the new village that they saw in front of them as safety. Arrows arced from the forest and cut them down as they ran. People from Sarissa's village stood in shock, standing and staring, watching as people they knew from market were cut before them by arrow fire. And then the king appeared. The king's back to the village, sword in hand, knights arrayed before him like a wall. He yelled, he screamed, he ordered for fighting, for courage. But they were outnumbered, and as they were pressed back out of the forest, knights fell. As they were pressed back, the attackers appeared. 100 men, greater in number than the king's guard, armoured and bearing weapons. Behind them came archers, arrows arcing over the top. The men of the village knew their duty and ran for their swords. Few had time to do more than shrug on chainmail or pull on an arming jacket, let alone wear the full hauberk or helmet that they had been given when they joined the army. The men of the village charged forward, all those others watching on in shock as they charged, arrows arced from the forest, over the king and into the running men. This is when things changed for Sarissa. Sarissa watched as her father and her brother, and even her prospective husband, were cut down by arrows. No one is sure whether it is the fact she had been practicing the dance for weeks, or whether it is the fact that she cared, or whether it is the fact that she is a farmer's daughter and so used to hard work. But Sarissa rallied a cry and charged forwards on her own. Into the hail of fire. She wore thin armor, but armor nonetheless. Arrows were deflected, and soon she was with the king. All the knights who were with her could tell she was female. It's hard to miss the shape of a dancer. But most of the knights rallied to her instantly, for she was the embodiment of the god of battle. She danced through the battle as if it were a gay parade. She danced and she twisted. The battle opened before her like some tradition that she'd seen her whole life. Each movement she knew. Each turn and twist, each dip, each push and thrust. Her sword cut down again and again, and soon the king's knights rallied to her and cut forwards. The battle was long and bloodied, but by the end of it, Sarissa found herself, a farmer's daughter, standing beside the king, sword coated in blood, armor hold, but alive, and indeed, according to the king's own knights, a saviour and a true warrior. What followed turned Sarissa from a farmer's daughter to one of the king's most trusted bodyguard, to a betrayer, and even worse, to a queen herself. But those are stories for another day. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.